The glass was cold in his hand, a small island of familiar reality in a sea of sparkling confusion. He wasn't sure what was in it, just that he'd asked the bartender for something with no alcohol. "Please," and the man had given him a sympathetic nod before pouring something clear and adding a lime. It was probably just soda water, but it felt like a life raft. He stood near a massive sculpture of a swan, which he quickly realized was made entirely of ice. Little drops of water were already beginning to trace paths down its elegant, frozen neck, a silent countdown to its inevitable melting into a forgotten puddle. He felt a strange kinship with the swan. The room was a symphony of things he didn't understand. Laughter bubbled up like champagne from a dozen different conversations, none of which he could follow. It was a language of loud jokes, knowing winks, casual references to people and places he'd only ever read about in business magazines. The air was thick with the smell of expensive perfume, roasting meat on tiny skewers, and the faint, clean scent of money. He tugged at the collar of his shirt. It was a new shirt, bought specifically for this occasion, and it felt stiff and foreign, like a costume he was forced to wear. His own clothes, the soft, worn t-shirts and comfortable jeans he lived in, were hanging in his closet at home, probably feeling as abandoned as he did. His boss, a kind but practical woman who saw the world in spreadsheets and project timelines, had all but pushed him out the door on Friday. "You have to go, Leo," she had said, not looking up from her monitor. "It's good for visibility. People need to see the faces behind the work." He had mumbled some excuse about a server migration, but she'd just waved it off. "The servers will be fine. The team needs to be seen." So here he was, being seen. Or rather, standing in a corner while trying his absolute best to be invisible. It felt less like an invitation and more like a summons, a requirement for a job he was otherwise very good at. In the quiet of his office, surrounded by the gentle hum of servers and the clean logic of code, he was a master. Here he was just a prop. He watched the room with an analyst's eye, categorizing the data points of human interaction. There were the sharks, the sales and marketing executives who moved with a predator's grace, always scanning the room for someone more important to talk to. Their smiles were bright, but their eyes were always calculating. Then there were the drones, the mid-level managers like himself, who clustered in small, anxious groups, laughing too loudly at jokes that weren't that funny. Their glasses of champagne clutched like weapons in a social arms race. And then there were the whales, the senior executives and board members, who floated serenely above it all, accepting the deference of the sharks and the drones as if it were there. Birthright, his gaze settled on one of the biggest sharks, a man with a jawline so sharp it could cut glass, and a suit that looked like it had been tailored onto his body. This man was the head of sales, the golden boy of the company, the one who stood on stage at the quarterly meetings, took all the credit for the record-breaking numbers that Leo's team had quietly crunched. He was holding court right now, a small constellation of admirers orbiting his bright energy. He had a voice that carried a deep, confident baritone that could be heard even over the orchestra of chatter. He was telling a story, something about a golf game with a potential client. In every few sentences, his group would erupt in a chorus of genuine, admiring laughter. Leo couldn't hear the words, but he could see the performance. The easy gestures, the confident lean, the way he made every person in that circle feel like they were the most important person in the room. It was a kind of magic, a social alchemy that Leo had never been able to master. He took a sip of his soda water, the lime tart on his tongue. He preferred his own kind of magic, the magic of a complex algorithm suddenly resolving itself into a perfect, elegant solution. The beauty of 1,000 lines of code working in perfect harmony to accomplish a single simple task. That world made sense. It was built on rules and logic. If you did a B would happen. There were no hidden meanings, no social games, no need to pretend you understood a joke about yachts or stock options. In his world, his value was in the quality of his work, a simple, measurable thing. In this room, value seemed to be tied to how loudly you could talk and how many people you could convince to listen. A woman with a laugh like shattered glass bumped into him, spilling a few drops of her red wine onto the floor. "Oh, sorry," she said, not really looking at him, her eyes already scanning for someone more interesting to talk to. He just nodded and mumbled, "It's okay," but she was already gone, absorbed back into the flowing river of the party. He looked down at the small red splatters on the polished marble floor. They looked like tiny, bloody wounds. He suddenly felt a powerful urge to go home, to take off this stiff shirt and sit at his own desk, in his own quiet apartment, and just listen to the hum of his computer. That was his party. That was where he belonged. He checked his phone for the time, a classic move for the socially awkward. It had only been 45 minutes. It felt like for hours. He started plotting his escape route. The main entrance was too exposed. He'd have to cross the dance floor, which was slowly starting to fill up. Maybe there was a side door near the kitchens or the restrooms. He could just slip away, send a quick email to his boss in the morning saying he had a great time but had to leave early. It was a white lie, a social lubricant, but it felt better than staying here for another minute. Feeling the ice swan's slow, cold drip of water mirror the slow, cold drip of his own confidence. He was just about to start his slow, careful migration toward the edge of the room when he felt a change in the atmosphere. It was a subtle shift, like the barometric pressure dropping before a storm. He looked up from his phone, and his eyes met the one pair of eyes he had been desperately trying to avoid. The head of sales, the golden boy, had finished his story. His admirers were dispersing, and he was standing alone for a moment, scanning the room. And then it happened. A pair of eyes, sharp and confident, cut through the crowd and landed directly on him. A slow, predatory smile spread across the man's perfect face. He had found his next target. And Leo, clutching his glass of soda water, felt like a small, cornered animal. The moment their eyes met, a cold dread washed over him, sharp and sudden. It was like spotting a great white shark while wading in the shallows. The man in the impeccably tailored suit, the head of sales, broke away from his group. He didn't walk. He glided, moving through the dense crowd with an unnerving ease. People seemed to part for him, a subconscious recognition of his power in this particular ecosystem. He was smiling, but it wasn't a friendly smile. It was the smile of a hunter who had just locked onto his prey. The protagonist's grip tightened on his glass, the condensation making his palm feel slick and clammy. His mind raced, searching for an exit, a distraction, anything to avert the collision course he was now on. But it was too late. The path was clear, and the shark was closing in. With a final, confident stride, the man arrived. He wasn't alone. Two others, a man and a woman, both dressed in the same expensive, uniform-like style of upper management, flanked him like lieutenants. They formed a semicircle around him, a casual but inescapable wall. "Well, look who we have here." The head of sales boomed, his voice deliberately loud enough to cut through the surrounding chatter. He threw a heavy arm around the protagonist's shoulders, pulling him in close. The gesture was meant to be friendly, but it felt like a shackle. The man's cologne was strong, a woody, spicy scent that smelled like ambition and money. "Hiding in the corner, my friend? We can't have that. The brains of the operation needs to be seen." He felt a knot of anxiety tighten in his stomach. He could feel the eyes of the two lieutenants on him, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and cool appraisal. He forced a weak smile, the kind that doesn't reach your eyes. "Just taking it all in," he managed to say, his voice barely a whisper. The man laughed, a loud, practiced sound. "Taking it all in. I love it. That's what makes you so good at your job, isn't it? You see things no one else does." He turned to his companions, his arm still a heavy weight on the protagonist's shoulders. "I was just telling these two about the new predictive sales model, the one that's going to make us all a lot of money next quarter. It's incredible. It's like it can see into the future." He looked down at him, his eyes glinting. "And you're the genius behind the numbers, right? The wizard in the basement. Tell us, what's the secret? Is it some kind of magic?" The question hung in the air, a trap disguised as a compliment. He could feel a trickle of sweat make its way down his temple. He knew the man wasn't genuinely interested. This was a performance. He was the prop. It's not magic," he stammered, his mouth dry. "It's mostly regression analysis. We use weighted datasets to identify key variables, and then we project future trends based on historical patterns, said the words carefully. Proud of the work in his own world, but immediately realizing how they sounded in this one. They were clunky, technical, and utterly boring. The head of sales's grin widened. He let go of his shoulders and took a step back, throwing his hands up in mock wonder. Regression analysis, he exclaimed, his voice echoing slightly. Did you all hear that? Weighted datasets. He looked at his companions, who chuckled obediently. The woman gave a little shake of her head as if to say, "Oh, you tech guys."
Ow.
The man just smirked into his drink. The protagonist felt his face begin to burn. He could see other people nearby turning their heads, drawn by the loud voice and the spectacle, while we're out here making it rain. Shaking hands and closing deals, the man continued, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial tone before rising again for the punchline. Our friend is in the basement making it regress. He roared with laughter, a full-throated, booming sound that seemed to suck all the air out of the space around them. It was a sharp, cruel sound, and it pierced through the polite murmur of the party like a siren. His lieutenants joined in, their laughter a higher-pitched, more nervous echo. A few other people nearby, who had been watching, let out polite, uncertain chuckles. He stood there, frozen. The heat in his face was now a full-blown fire. He could feel the blood pulsing in his ears. He wanted the floor to crack open and swallow him whole. He wanted to disappear, to become the ice swan, to melt into a forgotten puddle on the marble floor. The word regress echoed in his mind. It sounded so pathetic, so backward. It was the opposite of progress, the opposite of everything this company celebrated. And in that moment, he felt like the most pathetic, backward person in the room. He wasn't a person to them. He was a function, a nerdy punchline to a joke he didn't understand. He saw the smug satisfaction on the man's face, the way he savored the laughter and the attention. It wasn't just a joke. It was a public branding. He was being marked as an outsider, someone to be mocked, not respected. He couldn't speak. His throat had closed up. He just stood there, clutching his glass, his eyes fixed on a point on the floor just past the man's expensive leather shoes. He could feel the weight of their gazes, the judgment, the pity, the amusement. It was a physical pressure, pushing down on him, crushing him. The party sounds faded into a dull, distant roar. All he could hear was the echo of that laughter, replaying over and over in his head. It was the sound of his own inadequacy. It's given a voice and a face by the man in the sharp suit. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the man seemed to tire of the game. He gave the protagonist another hard, too friendly pat on the back. Anyway, great to see you, my man. Keep up the good work. Regressing things? He winked, then turned back to his group, already moving on to the next topic, the next target. The little circle broke apart, and the moment was over. But the shame remained. Clinging to him like a foul odor, he mumbled something that might have been "excuse me," and turned, his legs feeling like they were made of lead. He didn't know where he was going. He just knew he had to get away. He walked blindly, his head down, not caring who he bumped into. He just needed to move, to put distance between himself and the scene of his public humiliation. The laughter of the head of sales followed him, a ghost that haunted his every step. He felt small, invisible in the worst possible way. He wasn't just unseen. He was seen for all the wrong reasons, reduced to a single, humiliating moment. He was no longer a person. He was a joke, and the joke was on him. He walked away, but the laughter didn't stay behind. It followed him, clinging to his back like a wet, heavy cloak. Each step was an effort, his legs feeling like they were wading through invisible mud. The vibrant, sparkling party around him blurred into a meaningless swirl of color and light. The happy chatter, the clinking glasses, the soft music hit, all merged into a dull, distant roar like the sound of a faraway ocean. He was a ghost, moving through a world that was no longer his own, a world that had just pointed at him and laughed. He kept his head down, his eyes fixed on the polished marble floor, watching the reflections of the lights dance and swirl like distorted stars. He just needed to find a corner, a dark, forgotten corner where he could disappear and wait for the feeling of being punched in the gut to go away. He navigated through the crowd without really seeing anyone, his body operating on a basic instinct to flee. He passed a group of women with sequin dresses that shimmered like fish scales, their high-pitched laughter a series of sharp, meaningless sounds. He saw a man gesticulating wildly, a story tumbling out of him, his audience hanging on his every word. It was all a performance, and he had just been given the worst role in the play, the fool. He finally reached the edge of the main ballroom, where the lights were dimmer and the noise was a soft, distant rumble. There was a wide hallway here, leading to what looked like restrooms and private function rooms. He was about to just slump against the wall and slide to the floor, but then he saw it, tucked away in a small alcove at the end of the hallway. Almost hidden in the shadows was a grand piano. It wasn't just any piano. It was a magnificent creature of gleaming black lacquer and polished chrome. It sat there, silent and majestic, like a sleeping beast. The dim lighting from a wall sconce caught its curved side, creating a deep, reflective shine. It looked completely out of place, a serious, dignified instrument in a room full of fleeting, superficial joy. It was clearly just for decoration, a prop to add a touch of class to the event. But to him it was a lighthouse in a storm. It was an anchor. He found himself walking towards it, drawn by an invisible force. The humiliation was still a raw, open wound, but seeing the piano was like a cool breeze on a fevered skin. He stopped a few feet away, just looking at it. He remembered another piano, an old upright with chipped ivory keys and a wood frame that smelled of lemon oil and thyme. He remembered his grandmother's house, the one with the big bay window and the garden full of overgrown roses. That piano was the heart of her home, and it had become the heart of him. He could almost feel the texture of the worn velvet on the bench where he used to sit, a small boy whose feet couldn't reach the pedals. He could smell the faint scent of lavender that always seemed to follow his grandmother. He remembered her wrinkled, gentle hands covering his, guiding his small fingers to the correct keys. "Don't just press the key, darling," she would say, her voice soft and warm like a blanket. "Feel the note. Let it sing through you." She wasn't just teaching him to play. She was teaching him a different way to speak, a language that didn't require words. It was a language of emotion, of joy and sadness, of quiet contemplation and soaring triumph. After she passed away, the piano became his sanctuary, the one place where the quiet, introverted boy could be loud and powerful without ever saying a word. He hadn't played for anyone in years. Not since her funeral, in fact. He played for himself, late at night, in his small apartment, on a cheap digital keyboard with headphones plugged in. It was his private therapy, his way of processing a world that often felt too loud and too complicated. The logic of code and the beauty of music were the two things that made sense to him. They were both built on patterns and rules, but they both had the capacity to create something truly beautiful and profoundly human. He looked back down the hallway, towards the muffled sounds of the party. He could still hear the echo of that man's laughter, the cruel, mocking sound of the word regress. Part of him, the wounded, angry part, wanted to march back in there and show them. He wanted to make them feel small, the way they had made him feel. He wanted to sit at that piano and play something so complex, so brilliant, that it would silence their laughter and make them see him as something more than a punchline. But another quieter part of him hesitated. What if he was rusty? What if his fingers fumbled? What if they just laughed again? The thought of a second round of public humiliation was almost unbearable. He stood there, torn between fear and a desperate need for redemption. He looked at the piano again, at the elegant, silent keys. They weren't judging him. They weren't laughing at him. They were just waiting. And in that moment, he realized something. This wasn't about them. It wasn't about getting revenge on the man in the sharp suit, or proving something to the people who chuckled along. This was about him. It was about the quiet boy who found his voice in music. It was about the memory of his grandmother's hands on his. It was about reclaiming the one part of himself that they couldn't touch. The one part of him that was truly and completely his own. The fear didn't disappear, but it changed. It became a quiet energy, a hum of determination that pushed back against the shame. He wasn't playing to win them over. He was playing to win himself back. He took a deep breath, the first real full breath he had taken since the man had put his arm around him. He walked the last few steps to the piano, his shoes making soft, scuffing sounds on the floor. He reached out and gently ran a finger along the smooth, cool wood of the side. It felt solid, real, and reassuring. He pulled out the heavy bench and sat down, the cool leather, a familiar sensation against his thighs. He lifted the fallboard, revealing the pristine white and black keys. They looked like a promise. He placed his fingers on them, his hands settling into a familiar, comfortable position. The world outside the alcove, the party, the laughter, the shemet, all faded away. There was only him and the piano and the music that was waiting to be born. His fingers hovered over the keys, feeling a slight tremor. It wasn't from fear, not anymore. It was an anticipation, like the feeling just before a thunderstorm breaks, when the air is thick with electric possibility. He closed his eyes, shutting out the dim hallway, the distant party, the memory of the mocking laughter. He was no longer in a lavish ballroom. He was back in his grandmother's living room, the scent of lavender in the air, her patient voice guiding his hands. He took one last deep breath and let his fingers find their home. The first notes were not a declaration, but a whisper. A few simple, haunting chords from a Chopin nocturne floated into the air, delicate and uncertain. They were so quiet at first that they were almost swallowed by the ambient noise of the party. But the sound had a quality to it, a purity that cut through the clutter. It was like a single thread of silver in a tangled mess of yarn. He played the opening melody, a simple, melancholic tune that spoke of quiet longing and peaceful nights. His fingers, which had felt clumsy and stiff just moments before, began to remember their old strength. They moved with a certainty that his mind had lost, finding the notes as if by instinct. At first, no one really noticed. The piano was just background music, another element of the party's expensive decor. A waiter, carrying a tray of empty glasses, paused for a split second, his head cocked to the side, a flicker of confusion on his face. Before he continued on his path, a couple standing near the hallway entrance, deep in a hushed conversation, slowly trailed off. The woman turned her head, her brow furrowed, trying to locate the source of the unexpected melody. The music was a puzzle piece that didn't fit the picture of the party, and it was drawing attention. The head of sales was in the middle of another story, his voice a confident boom. He was describing a daring negotiation tactic, painting himself as a corporate hero. His small audience was rapt, hanging on his every word. But as the melody from the piano grew a little stronger, weaving its intricate patterns through the air, a crack appeared in his performance. One of his listeners, a young woman in a blue dress, turned her head slightly, her focus drifting away from his story. He faltered for a moment, annoyed by the distraction. He tried to talk louder, to reclaim his audience, but it was like trying to shout over the tide. The music was insistent, gentle but unyielding force that was pulling the room's attention away from him. Leo was lost now. The world had fallen away, and there was only the music. He was no longer thinking about the notes or the mechanics of playing. His hands were moving on their own, guided by years of practice and a deep well of emotion. The melody began to swell, growing in complexity and intensity. It was no longer just a sad, quiet tune. It was a conversation, a story being told in a language everyone could understand, even if they couldn't name the notes. It spoke of a struggle, of a quiet desperation that built and built, searching for a release. He poured all of it into the keys. The feeling of being an outsider, the sting of the word regress, the memory of his grandmother's gentle encouragement, the lonely comfort of late-night coding sessions. It was all there, in the rising and falling of the melody. The transformation in the ballroom was remarkable. Conversations died one by one, like candles being snuffed out. The clinking of glasses ceased. People stopped mid-sentence, their drinks held forgotten in their hands. They turned, their faces searching, their eyes drawn towards the dimly lit hallway where the sound was coming from. The orchestra of social chatter had been replaced by a single, powerful solo. A path began to form through the crowd as people started to move quietly towards the source of the music. Drawn by a curiosity that had quickly turned into captivation. The head of sails stood alone, his story unfinished. His face was a mask of confusion and irritation. He had lost his audience. The center of gravity in the room had shifted, and he was no longer it. He watched as his own admirers drifted away, their faces now turned towards the piano with expressions of awe and wonder. He could see the CEO, who had been speaking with the board of directors, also turn his head, his practiced smile replaced by a look of genuine intrigue. The power that the man in the sharp suit had wielded so effortlessly just minutes before had evaporated, dissolved by a cascade of beautiful, heartbreaking notes. Leo's fingers were flying now, dancing across the ivory keys with a speed and grace that seemed impossible. The music reached its crescendo, a torrent of sound that was both chaotic and controlled, a storm of emotion that filled the vast hall. It was a cry of despair and a shout of triumph all at once. It was the sound of a quiet man finally finding his voice, and it was breathtaking. A single hot tear escaped from his closed eye and traced a path down his cheek, but he didn't notice. He was completely submerged in the current of the music, riding it to its powerful, crashing conclusion, and then, suddenly as it had begun, it was over. His fingers pressed the final, resonant chord, and he held it, letting the sound hang in the air for a long moment before it faded into a profound and absolute silence. The silence was heavier and more potent than the noise that had come before. It was a sacred space, filled with the ghost of the melody. No one moved. No one spoke. They just stood there, held in the thrall of what they had just witnessed, their minds trying to process the unexpected journey they had just been taken on. The awkward man from the basement had just filled the room with a beauty so raw and powerful it had silenced them all. The final chord faded, but its echo seemed to hang in the air, a ghost of a sound that filled every corner of the vast hall. For a long, stretched-out moment, there was nothing but silence. It wasn't an awkward or empty silence. It was heavy, thick, and sacred. It was the kind of quiet that falls in a forest after a sudden dramatic storm. When the birds are too stunned to sing, and the air itself seems to be holding its breath, people stood frozen, their drinks still in their hands, their eyes fixed on the dimly lit hallway. Their faces were a mixture of awe, confusion, and a dawning, profound respect. The man in the stiff shirt, the quiet data analyst, had just pulled something beautiful and raw out of the decorative piano, and they were all trying to understand what had just happened to them. He sat with his hands still resting on the keys, his head bowed. His chest rose and fell with each deep, ragged breath. He wasn't thinking about the crowd. He wasn't thinking about the applause or the attention. He was still adrift in the wake of the music, feeling the ebb and flow of the emotions he had poured into the instrument. He felt a strange mix of exhaustion and elation. Like a runner who had just completed a marathon, he never knew he was going to run. A single cool tear that had escaped during the performance now dried on his cheek, leaving a faint, tight sensation on his skin. Then, a single person started clapping. It was not a loud or confident clap, but a slow, deliberate one. It came from an older man near the front, a man with kind eyes who looked like he had seen a lot of concerts in his time. Then another person joined in, and another. The sound grew, hesitant at first, then building in speed and volume until it became a wave. It wasn't the polite, obligatory clapping that follows a CEO's speech. This was different. It was a wave of genuine, thunderous appreciation that washed over the room, a spontaneous eruption of gratitude for the unexpected gift they had just received. People were not just clapping. They were cheering, some of them whistling, their faces lit up with a joy that was real and unforced. He finally looked up, his eyes slowly focusing on the scene before him. The sea of faces, all turned towards him, was a startling sight. He saw the young woman in the blue dress, her hands clasped to her chest, a look of pure wonder on her face. He saw waiters who had stopped in their tracks, their trays held loosely at their sides. And then he saw the head of sales, standing alone in the space where his crowd had been. The man's perfect posture had slumped. His confident smirk was gone, replaced by a look of utter disbelief and a flicker of something that looked like defeat. He had been the king of this party just minutes ago, and now he was just another subject in the audience, his throne usurped by a man at a piano. As the applause continued to roar, a path began to open in the crowd. People were stepping aside, their eyes still on him, creating a clear walkway from the main ballroom to the piano. Through this gap walked the CEO, a man whose face was usually a carefully constructed mask of professional charm. But now, the mask was gone. His expression was one of pure, unadulterated awe. He walked with a purpose that was different from the head of sales's predatory glide. This was the walk of a pilgrim who had just witnessed a miracle. He arrived at the piano, and the applause softened, then died down as people leaned in to hear. The CEO didn't say anything at first. He just looked at the protagonist, then at the piano, then back at him, as if trying to connect the two disparate images in his mind. That was the CEO began, his voice quiet, almost a whisper, but it carried in the now silent room. That was extraordinary. The word was spoken with a weight and sincerity that the protagonist had never heard from him before. I have been to a lot of these parties, the CEO continued, his eyes scanning the room for a moment before returning to him. I have heard a lot of speeches. I have never heard anything like that. I had no idea. He paused, a look of genuine curiosity on his face. What's your name, son? The protagonist felt a lump form in his throat. All the shame and humiliation from earlier had been washed away, replaced by a quiet, steady warmth. He looked at the CEO not as an intimidating figure of power, but just as another person in the room who had been moved by the music. It's Leo, he said, his voice clear and steady, surprising even himself. The CEO just nodded, a slow, deep nod of profound respect. There was no follow-up question, no offer of a promotion, no empty platitude. He didn't need to say anything more. The look in his eyes said it all. He saw Leo now. Not as a function, not as a punchline, but as a whole person with a hidden, beautiful depth. He gave Leo one last appreciative smile, then turned and walked back into the crowd, which parted for him again before closing up the gap. Leo knew this was his moment to stand up, to take a bow, to accept the praise that was still rippling through the room. But that wasn't who he was. He hadn't done this for them. He had done it for his grandmother, for the quiet boy he used to be, and for the man he was now. He gave a small, polite nod to the people closest to him, then gently lowered the keyboard lid. He stood up, pushed the bench back in, and turned to leave. As he walked away, a strange thing happened. The crowd didn't swarm him. They just watched him go, their faces filled with a new kind of respect. People stepped aside to let him pass, but this time, it wasn't out of intimidation or social hierarchy. It was an act of deference. He walked through the same party he had entered an hour ago, but it was a completely different world. The laughter no longer sounded mocking. The chatter no longer felt exclusive. He was still the same quiet man in the same stiff shirt, but something inside him had shifted. He was no longer an outsider trying to get in. He was a man who had a world inside of him so rich and so deep that their world couldn't possibly contain it. He pushed through the heavy glass doors and stepped out into the cool night air. The city was alive with distant sounds, the hum of traffic, and the wail of a faraway siren. He took a deep, clean breath, filling his lungs with the fresh, cool air. He felt the stiffness in his shirt collar, but it didn't bother him anymore. It was just a shirt. He looked up at the stars, faint pinpricks of light in the orange-hued city's sky. He didn't feel triumphant or victorious. He just felt whole. He had walked into the party feeling like a joke, and he was leaving feeling like a song. And as he started walking down the street, away from the lights and the music, he knew that he would never again let anyone make him feel like his world was smaller than theirs. It wasn't. It was just quieter. And sometimes the quietest things have the most to say.